Y'all know that I struggle around the holidays to come up with new material after preaching for the last 9 years on certain holidays when they come around. There's only so many different ways you can say certain things. There's so many stories that apply to the different holidays. And Mother's Day was coming around, and I was once again kind of struggling figuring out what I was going to talk about. And I actually turned to the lectionary this time around, and there was a story that I've read, but have never preached on. And I read through it, and I thought, well, this is really neat. I'm not really sure what the single point is that I could draw from this story, but it's kind of one of those things where, a lot of times when I preach, I always try to make sure that there's some nugget you can take away from it, some bullet statement. And I got to thinking about this story this week, and it began rolling around in my head, and there wasn't really like a distinct single point that I could give you that you'll take away from this particular story. But it kept working through my head, kind of like a good plant. Like you put it in the ground and the roots kind of go in your head. And it's kind of like there's this big thing that I can't define, I can't describe, I don't know what it is, but it's just a unique story. And so what I decided to do is, because it's rolling around in my head and I'm pondering the deep message of this story, I'm going to present it to you. And so then you can maddeningly go over this story yourselves all week long. So there you go. You're welcome. Now, like I said, this story is a little bit different, this sermon. So a few years back, and I say a few years, at my age, when I say a few years back, it could be 20 at this point, because I say things like, oh, that was just a couple years ago, and my wife said, honey, that was 15 years ago. So a few years back is a qualified statement. I don't know exactly when this happened. I know it just happened a while ago. So a few years back, a church, not a church that I was a part of, but a church in our community, kind of up where I was from, decided to hire a new pastor. Now this pastor, Lord help him, was a simple soul. He was one of those people who said, the Bible said it, I believe it, and that settles it. At least about the things that he wanted it to say. You might say he was a literalist. He believed everything in the Bible was literally true, and if you needed to practice it just like it's written. No further analysis, no context was needed. Now, we all know people who think this way actually practice selective literalism. They only like the parts that they like, and the other parts they tend to ignore. And this fellow, he really seemed fixated on the role of women in church. That was the thing that he fixated on. And so he would always, one of the passages that I'm sure that he, and I never met the man, this is one of those stories like you hear from people in the church, but I never met the man specifically. But I can imagine him pulling like from 1 Timothy 2:12, where it says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. Now I know this is Mother's Day, so don't string me up. You know I'm going somewhere with this. I'll get there. There's a lot of background and context with this passage in 1 Timothy, and if you've been in a part of our Wednesday night Bible studies, we've dove deep into all of these letters of Paul, and we've unpacked it. But this fellow, he read passages like this literally. So once he became pastor, and for him, pastor meant boss, not shepherd. He implemented a policy of removing all women from all leadership roles. That meant no women on any committees, no women teaching classes above nursery, and no women's only Bible study. That's right, women, the male pastor sat in on the women's Bible study. Yeah, I would never do that here. No. Now, the church kind of went along with all of this. Now, there were some who left, but I was really surprised about how many people kind of put up with this, for lack of a better word, lunacy. However, this fellow, he made one fatal mistake. One mistake. Since men were supposed to be the head of all things, he made men run the vacation Bible school that summer. Yeah. Can you imagine nothing but men running the vacation Bible school? Yeah, now the women could manage the kitchen, but that was it. So men were teaching, men were leading, men were doing all of the things with all of the kids. Men only, men in charge. let's just say he didn't last very long. By the next summer, he was gone. It's funny how people only want to take the parts of the Bible that support their point of view and ignore the bits that challenge them. Using this one verse and a few others like it, people have used them to push women to the margins of ministry for years. But here's the thing. These verses aren't the only narrative about the role of women in the church. And a cursory reading through the book of Acts, and yes, some even of Apostle Paul's own letters, we find women who are hosting churches in their homes, acting as prophets, speaking, and even one labeled as a disciple. Acts chapter 9, verses 36 through 43. In Joppa, there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek, her name is Dorcas. She was always doing good and helping the poor. About that time she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Now Lydda was near Joppa, and Peter was there. So when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, "Please come at once." Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room. All the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. Peter sent them all out of the room, and then he got down on his knees and prayed. Turning to the dead woman, he said, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet, and then he called for the believers, especially the widows, and presented her to them alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many people believed in the Lord. Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon. There was a disciple named Tabitha. Now, if any of you are Greek scholars out there, which I'm not, I have to rely on other people to be Greek scholars for me. The word translated disciple here literally means disciple. It's a feminization of the exact word used to describe the 12 disciples of Jesus. Even Old King James translates the word that way. She is a woman disciple, period. Now, an interesting thing about her discipleship is that it is marked by the description of always doing good and helping the poor. Tabitha is a woman of action. She isn't sometimes doing good or occasionally doing good work. She is a woman who is all in, who spends her time either doing good in the world or thinking about what good she could do. She fully embodies the kingdom of heaven that Jesus talked about in the gospel. She is living her life for this kingdom. Now, I don't know about you because I'm a guy, and so a lot of times we think about male leadership role in the church. We talk a lot, but it's always the women who seem to get the things done that need to get done. In fact, every church that I have ever seen, small and large, and I've visited a lot of churches both here and abroad all over the world, it's always a group of women who are the backbone workers of the church. Now, sure, there may be men standing up front, but if you need to get anything done in a church, it's the women you go to. Don't believe me? How many of you have come to me as the pastor and asked me something about this church, and I have told you, go ask the women's group? You're laughing because you know. You've asked me. And I'm like, well, okay, go ask the women's group because they're the ones. It's a lesson I learned very early in ministry. So this disciple, this woman Tabitha, her ministry, her call is to do the work among the poorest of the poor in her community. Now keep in mind, the poorest of the poor are usually women. There's no social safety net. If a woman who is a widow doesn't have a family that can take care of her once she's widowed, she's pretty much left destitute. She's left on the streets. Her options are begging or prostitution. That's the way the world worked back then. And this is the kind of people that Tabitha is called to. She's probably a woman who has a bit of means to her. She probably has a little bit of money. And she is called to be all in, working with this population. But something happens along the way. She gets sick. And like a lot of women I know, they get sick and they will hide it and do everything they can to keep going until they can't anymore. because that's just the way I know women and mothers. I know that's how they operate. She gets sick, probably doesn't take care of herself, and she dies. The calling of the kingdom can be all-encompassing sometimes, because you see so much darkness and pain in the world, and you want to do whatever you can to be the light, sometimes even the detriment to our own health. And I kind of picture, I'm reading between the lines here, but I kind of picture this is what's happened with Tabitha. She is a woman on a mission, she is on fire, and the mission consumed her. And she just plows on ahead with the call. We know Tabitha, like I said, must be a woman of some means. She's laid out in an upper room. And very few people in first century Palestine have an upstairs. And apparently she was the center of her faith community. And her church, when she passed, did not know what to do. They were lost without her. Now, word reached the church that Peter was in a town about 10 miles south of Joppa. And not knowing what else to do, when the woman who's in the center of everything is gone, then what do the men do? They go find somebody, they got to run. So they send, that's interesting in the story. Who do they dispatch? They dispatch a couple of men. A couple of men are going to go get Peter, because maybe he can help them figure out what to do next. So they go get Peter, and they come back, bring him back. And keep in mind, this is all on foot. And upon his arrival, Peter is immediately beset by all of the poor widows who Tabitha has been providing for. And they are beside themselves with grief. Now, I wonder what Peter is thinking at this point. Because we don't know if Peter and Tabitha ever met before. Maybe, maybe not. But what I like to think was going through Peter's mind was, here is such a true disciple of Jesus. One who the command, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, she took it literally. I mean, if you're going to take a command literally, those are the two I would tell you to take literally. A disciple who took the command, clothe the naked, literally. Peter immediately puts the people out of the room and begins to pray. Now, what's interesting is how it records Peter's prayer. Because at the time, it says Peter got down beside the bed, knelt and prayed. That's the typical prayer posture for us. But at the time of Peter, the typical prayer posture was to stand up, arms spread wide, eyes open, looking to heaven. That was how people typically prayed. But Peter doesn't do that. He takes a more somber tone. He kneels down beside this woman's bed, and we're not told what he says. But something happens. Peter gets some sort of sign or confirmation, because immediately he turns to the woman and says, Tabitha, get up. He doesn't ask it. He commands it. And she does. She gets right up. Now notice that he calls for all of the believers, the way the story says, but especially the poor widows. It says that. He says he called the believers, but especially the poor widows. The ones who she had been taken care of. The ones who in this upside down kingdom of God were actually the most important. Now, if you think this story is just about the miraculous healing of Tabitha, you miss the point. Tabitha's story is included in the Bible not just because she was raised from the dead, and not just because she was a woman, but because she was a disciple. And unfortunately, it is true that there are few people, few disciples of it, or any gender, who would risk their economic status like she did in order to provide for the less privileged. By taking such a risk, our good works and just acts challenge an unjust system. Many of us, when we consider giving, we kind of think about how it's going to diminish or impact the way we live. We're willing to talk about dying for Christ, but not risking our living for others. The world will never be a better place as the Tabithas are few. it is the spirit of Tabitha, the spirit in her that we hope that will take on this immortality among the living. Tabitha used the things that she had been given in this life, her wealth, her privilege, and all of these things, and she put them into service for the benefit of those around her. And if I could articulate the way that I see the mothers in my life act, it is that way. The way they pour the things that they have into the people around them, whether they are rich or whether they have nothing. They live for their families and even those who are adopted into their families. That is the power of the message of this story. Dear Heavenly Father, I love you so much, and I thank you for this day and this chance to be here. And my prayer is that we would read this story of the disciple named Tabitha. And my prayer is that, like it's done for me this week, it works through our mind, and we reflect on this very short passage and all of the ways that this woman reflected the best that is service to you. And my prayer is that we would be a people who would look to embody that kind of spirit in our own lives. Amen. Please stand.